Have you ever wondered why the person who walked away so easily is the same person who will one day miss you the most? Not immediately, not loudly, but deeply. Right now, it feels unfair. They pulled back. They went silent. They acted cold while you were still trying, and you were left questioning your value, your words, your worth. That silence hurts more than rejection, because rejection has an answer. Silence leaves you alone with your thoughts. But here's the truth most people never hear. Avoidants don't disappear because they don't care. They disappear because caring feels dangerous to them. Stay with this until the end, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why the silence is not the end of the story, and why the power slowly shifts back to you in ways you don't expect. When an avoidant pulls away, it looks like confidence. It looks like control. It looks like emotional strength. But psychologically, it's the opposite. Avoidants are wired to associate closeness with loss of control. Intimacy triggers fear, not comfort. Connection feels like a threat to their independence. So when emotions grow, they don't lean in, they retreat. Not because you asked for too much, not because you were not enough, but because closeness activates an alarm inside them. And here's where the mistake happens. You think their distance means they've moved on. You think their silence means they've forgotten you. You think if they cared, they would come back. But avoidants don't process emotions in real time. They delay them. They shut the door on feelings, not knowing that feelings don't disappear when ignored. They wait. And waiting creates pressure. Right now, in this phase, they feel relief. Relief from expectations. Relief from vulnerability. Relief from emotional responsibility. That's why the silence feels so sharp to you, because they seem calm while you feel everything. But that calm is temporary. It's borrowed peace. Avoidants regulate emotions through distance. You regulate emotions through connection. So when they leave, you feel the loss immediately. When they leave, they feel freedom first. This is where the psychology matters. The human brain does not register value during presence. It registers value during absence, and avoidants are masters at creating absence. But here's the part no one tells you. The brain also cannot miss what it is still emotionally running from. In the beginning, they are running from feelings, from attachment, from the version of themselves that felt safe with you. That's why they don't miss you yet, not because you didn't matter, but because missing requires emotional availability, and right now, they are emotionally shut down. They distract themselves, they stay busy, they convince themselves they are better off, they rewrite the story to protect their ego. This is not strength, this is survival. Avoidants survive by suppressing, and suppression always comes at a cost. The mind can only keep emotions buried for so long. The body remembers, the nervous system remembers, the silence becomes loud. And here's the painful irony. The very thing they feared, connection, becomes the thing they crave once it's gone. But it doesn't happen immediately. First comes denial, then comes numbness, then comes distraction, and then quiet. That quiet is dangerous, because in quiet moments there is no escape, no noise, no justification, no running. That's when memories surface, not the dramatic ones, the small ones. Your presence, your consistency, your calm, the way you made space without forcing. Avoidants don't miss chaos, they miss safety. But safety is only recognized once it's lost. Right now, you might be blaming yourself, replaying conversations, wondering what you should have said differently. Stop. Their silence is not your failure. It is their coping mechanism. And here's the most important psychological shift you need to hear. Chasing an avoidant reinforces their belief that distance keeps them safe. Letting go forces them to sit with what they lost. Silence works differently on different minds. For you, silence creates anxiety. For them, silence eventually creates reflection, and reflection creates regret. Not loud regret, not dramatic regret, quiet regret. The kind that shows up at night, the kind that questions decisions, the kind that whispers, "I felt something real there." But here's the reward for staying until the end of this video. By understanding this, you stop begging for validation. You stop waiting for closure. You stop shrinking yourself to be chosen. Because the moment you stop chasing clarity, you become the unanswered question in their mind. And unanswered questions are powerful. This is only the beginning. What happens next is where the real shift occurs. Because when the avoidant finally breaks, it doesn't look like drama. It looks like missing you. Badly. And that changes everything. When distance stretches long enough, something subtle begins to change inside the avoidant mind. Not on the surface, not in behavior, but underneath, where distraction no longer works the same way. Earlier, withdrawal felt like relief. Now, it starts to feel empty. This is the stage most people never see, because it happens quietly, internally, without announcements. Avoidant minds are built to suppress emotion, not resolve it. They rely on control to feel safe, control over time, control over space, control over feelings. But emotions are not obedient. They don't vanish because they are ignored. They wait. And waiting creates tension. At first, the avoidant fills the space with activity, work, noise, new routines, anything that keeps the mind occupied. But the human brain cannot stay distracted forever. Once novelty fades, the emotional weight returns. This is when the internal conflict begins. One part of them wants to stay detached, because detachment has always protected them. Another part starts to feel the absence more clearly, not as pain yet, as confusion. Why does this feel unfinished? Why does silence feel heavier now than before? This confusion is not longing. It's the breakdown of emotional avoidance. The avoidant nervous system is trained to shut down under emotional pressure. But when pressure builds slowly without escape, the shutdown stops working. And that's when memory becomes active. Not fantasy, not idealization. Memory. They don't think about what went wrong. They think about what felt stable, what felt grounding, what didn't demand performance. Avoidants do not attach easily, but when they do, it is deeply registered in the nervous system. That's why they don't miss fast. But when they do, it hits the body before the mind. A tight chest, restlessness, sleep disruptions, sudden emotional flashes with no clear cause. This is the mind signaling unresolved attachment. And here's a crucial psychological truth. Avoidants experience loss backward. Most people feel pain first, then acceptance. Avoidants feel relief first, then loss. This delayed emotional response is why they appear unaffected early on. But delay does not mean immunity. It means accumulation. Every unprocessed feeling stacks quietly, until the weight becomes noticeable. This is where internal questioning starts. Was that connection actually rare? Why did that presence feel different? Why does independence feel hollow now? These questions are uncomfortable because they challenge the identity avoidants rely on. They see themselves as self-sufficient, unattached, unmoved. But missing someone contradicts that image, so the mind resists. They minimize, they rationalize, they tell themselves it wasn't that deep. Yet the emotional response keeps returning, and repetition weakens denial. What they begin to realize is not that they lost you. It's that they lost access to a version of themselves that felt regulated around you. That's the core of missing. Not romance, not nostalgia. Regulation. You provided emotional steadiness without pressure. You offered presence without control. And that created safety. Safety is rare for avoidance, which is why it's only valued once it disappears. Now comes the most uncomfortable part. They cannot reach out yet, because reaching out requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like surrender. So instead, they observe, they check, they wonder, they imagine. Distance shifts roles. You are no longer the one seeking answers. They are. And here's where power dynamics change. Silence that once protected them now exposes them, because silence removes distraction. With no emotional anchor, the nervous system searches for familiarity. That familiarity is you, but the avoidant mind does not translate this into action immediately. It translates it into internal tension. They feel pulled toward connection and pulled away by fear. This push-pull creates emotional exhaustion, and exhaustion lowers defenses. When defenses drop, clarity appears. They begin to see the pattern, how they left when closeness increased, how they shut down instead of communicating, how they confused emotional distance with strength. This realization does not come with drama. It comes with heaviness, a quiet understanding that something meaningful slipped away because they didn't know how to stay. This is not regret yet. This is awareness. Awareness is dangerous for avoidance, because once seen, it cannot be unseen. And this awareness grows stronger the more grounded you become, not because you prove anything, but because your absence forces reflection. You are no longer available to stabilize their emotions. They must face them alone. And that is when missing begins to take shape, not as obsession, as recognition. Recognition that what they avoided was not danger. It was intimacy. And intimacy was exactly what they needed but didn't know how to hold. This section ends here for a reason, because once awareness turns into emotional clarity, the next stage is inevitable. The breaking point. And when that happens, the distance they created becomes the reason they miss you deeply. Awareness does not stay quiet forever. Once it settles in, it demands resolution. This is where the internal structure finally cracks. The avoidant has now reached a stage where emotional distance no longer brings relief. What once felt light now feels tense. What once felt freeing now feels unsettled. They begin to notice something disturbing. Life is moving forward, yet something inside them is stuck. This is the breaking point. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden confession, a slow emotional overload. The human mind can suppress feelings, but it cannot erase attachment once it has formed. Attachment leaves a trace, a psychological imprint, and that imprint starts to surface when control fails. Avoidants rely heavily on mental control to feel safe, but control weakens when emotion becomes persistent. Thoughts return without invitation. Images appear without effort. A familiar presence keeps resurfacing in quiet moments, not because they want it to, but because the mind seeks emotional completion. This is when missing becomes intense, not soft, not romantic, urgent. They begin to sense absence as loss, not intellectually, physically, a hollow feeling, a constant tension, an unexplained emotional pressure. This is the body signaling unresolved attachment stress. And here's the psychological shift that changes everything. They no longer feel above the situation. They feel inside it. Earlier, distance gave them a sense of power. Now, distance highlights what they can't access anymore. Connection. This creates emotional contrast. The brain compares states, before and after, calm and emptiness, presence and void. Contrast is what creates desire, and desire terrifies avoidance, because desire means dependence, and dependence challenges their core belief of self-reliance. So the mind resists again. They remind themselves why they left. They replay flaws, they exaggerate reasons, but this time, it doesn't work. Because the emotional data does not match the mental story, they begin to realize something uncomfortable. You did not drain them, you grounded them. You did not trap them, you regulated them, and regulation is addictive once lost. This is when missing turns painful, not because of loneliness, but because they recognize the role you played in stabilizing their emotional state. That realization creates regret, not explosive regret, contained regret, the kind that sits quietly and grows heavier over time. They see moments differently now. Small gestures gain new meaning. Consistency feels rare. They understand something too late. Security does not feel exciting when it is present. It feels essential when it disappears. This insight reshapes their internal narrative. They stop seeing themselves as untouched. They see themselves as someone who avoided something valuable. This threatens their identity. An identity threat creates emotional urgency. They feel the urge to reconnect, not to restart everything, but to relieve the internal pressure. Yet fear still stands in the way. Fear of exposure, fear of rejection, fear of admitting they were wrong. So they hesitate. This hesitation amplifies the missing, because inaction allows emotion to build. An emotional buildup eventually demands release. This is where emotional walls fail. The avoidant reaches a point where avoidance becomes more painful than vulnerability. That is the real break. Not tears, not panic. A decision forming beneath the surface, a recognition that running no longer protects them. And here is where the shift becomes visible. They start looking outward. They notice your absence differently now, not as distance, as separation. They imagine scenarios. They wonder about your growth. They question whether you have moved on. This curiosity is not casual. It is attachment resurfacing. Attachment does not ask politely. It demands attention. They feel the loss of access, not just to you, to emotional safety. This is when longing becomes focused. Earlier, emotion was scattered. Now it has direction. You. And here's the most important psychological reality. The more grounded you become, the more intense their internal struggle grows. Not because you are trying, but because your stability contrasts with their unrest. Your silence now carries weight. It is no longer empty. It is meaningful, because silence from someone who has detached signals strength, and strength creates respect. Respect fuels attraction. Attraction fuels missing. This is the reversal. You are no longer reacting. You are no longer waiting. You are becoming the standard they failed to meet. This realization hits hard. They feel small. They feel late. They feel exposed. And that exposure brings humility. Humility is rare for avoidance, but it is necessary for reconnection. Whether they act on it or not, the emotional shift has already happened. They have crossed a psychological line. From detachment to desire, from control to craving, from absence to awareness of loss. This is not the end of the process. It is the moment everything changes. Because once an avoidant feels this deeply, they cannot return to emotional neutrality. Something has broken. And what breaks next is the distance itself. Once the distance begins to collapse inside them, the focus quietly shifts away from you. Not because you stop mattering, but because something more powerful takes over. You. Not the version that waited, not the version that questioned, but the version that chose forward motion. This is where the story reaches its deepest psychological turn, because the avoidant does not finally miss you due to loneliness. They miss you because they feel left behind. Human beings are wired to track relative position, not just emotionally, existentially. When someone senses that another person is evolving without them, the mind reacts sharply. Growth creates gravity, and when you stop trying to be understood, you begin to be felt. Your silence no longer asks for answers. It communicates self-respect. Your absence no longer signals loss. It signals direction. This triggers something primal. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to shifts in power, not dominance, inner alignment. When they sense that you are no longer oriented toward them, their nervous system loses its reference point. Earlier, they controlled distance. Now, distance controls them. They begin to realize that you are no longer emotionally accessible in the same way, not closed, grounded. That distinction matters. Grounded people do not pull, they do not persuade, they do not explain themselves repeatedly. They move, and movement creates contrast. The avoidant now compares two internal states. One where you were emotionally available, another where you are no longer waiting. That comparison creates urgency, because urgency is born when opportunity disappears. This is where missing turns sharp, not soft yearning, but focused awareness. They sense that reconnection is no longer guaranteed, and the human mind reacts strongly to lost certainty. Certainty creates comfort. Uncertainty creates obsession. They begin to think about you differently now, not as someone they could return to any time, but as someone who may no longer be reachable. That thought destabilizes them, because avoidants rely on the idea that independence keeps them safe. But safety disappears when control over access disappears. You are no longer a backup. You are no longer predictable. You are choosing yourself. This choice shifts the entire psychological balance. You are not trying to teach a lesson. You are not proving strength. You are simply living. And that is what makes you unforgettable. Humans are most impacted not by those who chase them, but by those who outgrow them. Growth communicates value without words. It tells the nervous system, this person is aligned, this person is moving forward. That signal creates attraction, not surface-level attraction. Deep, identity-level pull. The avoidant now experiences a conflict they cannot solve quickly. If they stay distant, they lose relevance. If they reach out, they risk exposure. This tension keeps you in their mind. Not because you demand attention, but because your absence reflects their stagnation. They see themselves clearly now, where they stayed guarded, where they froze, where they avoided depth. And clarity hurts, because clarity removes excuses. They begin to understand that connection requires courage, and courage was what they lacked. This realization does not come with anger. It comes with humility. Humility softens defenses, and softened defenses allow emotion to flow. That emotion is missing. Not idealized longing, respectful longing. They respect what you became, and respect is stronger than desire. Respect lingers. It does not fade quickly. It does not burn out. It sits quietly, reminding them of what they failed to rise into. Meanwhile, you are no longer waiting for validation. You are not watching for signs. You are not checking for movement. You are building something internal. Confidence that does not depend on response. Peace that does not require explanation. This inner stability is what shifts everything, because stability creates boundaries without force. You are no longer emotionally available by default. You are selective. Selectivity signals worth, and worth creates psychological pull. This is why they miss you badly. Not because you disappeared, but because you stayed true to yourself. You did not collapse. You did not beg. You did not betray your standards. You chose alignment over attachment. That choice echoes. It echoes in their quiet moments. It echoes in their comparisons. It echoes in their regret. They now understand something fundamental. You were not the one holding them back. You were the one they could have grown with. And that realization is heavy, because opportunities do not repeat forever. Whether they reach out or not is no longer the point. The real shift has already happened. You are no longer defined by their response. They are defined by their hesitation, and that is the final reversal. You did not lose them. You outgrew the version of them that could not stay. And that growth is what makes you impossible to forget, because when someone finally understands your value and realizes they can no longer access it, missing becomes permanent. And you move forward,